And today's topic is distinguishing story from experience. We experience our lives largely through the stories that we create about our experience, and it's often impossible to separate the experience itself from our story about it, our interpretation. So we're going to talk about how we might be able to dig more deeply into that capacity. But before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together. Vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop. And allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables us to experience life. Welcome, 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 and good morning. Good morning, Rosalind. So good to have you here with us this morning, and good morning to everyone else who's joining us. We're talking about distinguishing story from experience. So this is an interesting phenomena that I experience with a number of my clients as we work through the core connection process that I've developed, and what it is, or what this part of the process is what are you present to? What are you observing? And I find so often that people will go off into an explanation of something, an interpretation of what's happening or what happened, to discuss motivations and meanings. And while I understand that we create this matrix of meaning and interpretation as a way to integrate and understand our experience, those interpretations are often invisible to us, and as a result they shape our experience. So it's kind of this recursive loop where we have an experience, we try to interpret it to make some sense of it, then that becomes the experience itself, defining what the experience was, because it creates a visceral sense, it creates a reaction and response. So it's adding dimensionality to the original experience. So for instance, when we have an experience that we can't quite make sense of, we spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure it out. I just realized I don't have my background on today. How about that? I guess I should. Oh, well. It we create this extra dimensionality that makes it harder and harder to access the essence of the experience, the actual what happened part, not what did we think about it. part of the interpretive experience, or part of the what happened, is I felt a certain way. I experienced these particular emotions in my body with these sensations. That's part of the experience. Part of the experience is not going back and saying, well, this person had all kinds of their own wounds, for example, that motivated their behavior. And, that's all explanation, which then shapes the revisiting of that experience. So it builds, this is where the dimensionality comes from. It builds extra dimensions into that original experience. And then we don't distinguish one from the other. We make that explanation the experience. And it's a way that we, I think, protect and defend ourselves, perhaps, from the experience, or we buffer it, we try sanitize it, or we dramatize it, but it's all molding that original experience. And so one of the things that's become so clear to me is how utterly malleable reality is, our actual reality. And this was so clear in a session that I did with someone the other day. And this is also a wonderful example of how important it is for us to curate our own stories and curate our own reality, as I'll explain it. So this person was feeling a lack of safety, and we went back into their history where they could connect to themselves as the innocent child that they were. Innocent, playful, joyful, spontaneous. And they presenced themselves to that child and experienced this deep sense of safety that just radiated and engulfed them and and held them in this sense of safety and joy. And then they also, in this imaginal space, not imaginary, but imaginal, meaning we're projecting ourselves into an environment and creating it. It's got more weight than it just purely imaginary. Anyway, then they projected themselves into this other state where they felt safe and present. And then in that imaginal space, something came along and threatened that space, threatened that safety. And they experience this again in the imaginal space, but they have one of these biometric rings that tells them what's going on with them. And what happened was they got fearful and their blood pressure shot way up. Now, this is all sitting in the space of 10 minutes. So they were in the space of safety. They got in a space of fear. Their blood pressure and biometrics responded dramatically. And then we recreated the space of safety. I didn't ask them to check their blood pressure, but I know that their blood pressure went down because they were able to experience this sense of safety again. And this is the power of the stories we tell. So this is why I say over and over how deeply important it is to be curating our stories. because our stories have physiological impact. The way we remember things or the stories that we tell about things create emotions. Those emotions create physiological states. And so it behooves us for our physical health, our actual physical health, to be conscious and deliberate about the stories we create. We just need to do that. And we get so readily enmeshed in stories that are often not even of our own making. For instance, just the stories that are in the news. You know, we might be watching those newscasts, which are carefully curated to create engagement, which is often through fear, right? Through creating a sense of fear. And when we experience that fear and upset, it's affecting our physiology. And these stories that we see on the news and that we create for ourselves are largely interpretive stories. They're not just what happened, but the impact of what happened. Actually, you know, I have to say that sometimes that's not the case. And that's actually been a frustration for me, where certain things will be reported on the news, but not the implications of those stories. We're kind of left with this dump of information that we don't necessarily know how to contextualize, right? So we do the add-ons, and I guess that's what I'm talking about. These stories are presented as though they are just the facts, but they're not. They're very jaundiced facts. They're very skewed facts. The way that we're introduced to what we call factual information is often skewed. It's often presented in a very selective way, selective facts, which then can skew perception pretty dramatically, right? For instance, if we are looking at coverage of a conflict and we're only seeing one side of that conflict, or only hearing one side of that conflict, and then that's the reality that gets cultivated, and we're not really cognizant of the real the bigger picture, the whole picture. Anyway, this notion of distinguishing story from experience, it's like, well, what are you present to in our own experience? This is an important thing, is when we have an experience of upset about something, oftentimes we will be upset about something. We don't necessarily think to just have the experience. We're making the interpretation the experience itself. And we're creating new experience through those interpretations. So how do we make the distinction? One of the ways, and it's a discipline because so many of us have been taught to try to understand and we justify and we rationalize and we explain rather than experience. So, one of the ways that we can transcend that to allow that whole interpretive framework that can be really damaging, how we can allow it to loosen is by presencing ourselves to the experience itself. And the experience itself is, what am I seeing? What am I feeling emotionally? What is the sensation of that in my body? What am I hearing? What am I smelling? What am I tasting? So getting to the physical experience of it and observing those experiences and how they shift and change, then interestingly enough, often results in the story of what the experience is and the interpretation. It often results in a shift in that, which is pretty fascinating. By actually immersing ourselves in the experiential rather than the interpretive, the experience of the experiential changes with of its own volition, kind of, with its own momentum, which then changes the interpretation, which then changes the overall experience again. So it's kind of unwinding the spiral of that multidimensional layering of experience, where it's kind of allowing those layers to peel back and create an opening. I like the image of unwinding the spiral, because that's kind of what's happening. So we try to make sense of things. And in our trying to make sense of things, we create all kinds of stories. And then we interact with the stories as if they're true, like that's the fact of the matter or the essence of the matter. And it's important, I think it's valuable and important to recognize that they're not one and the same thing. We then blend them, we converge these two things or collapse these two things, and then we have an experience of quote unquote reality that is this elaborate construct. Even the physical experiences, physical, mental, emotional experience that we have in the moment of something. It's like, well, what was the thought that occurred? What was the sensation? What was the emotion? Even those things are often programmed by previous experience. So if somehow I've been taught that a mouse is something to be afraid of, when I see a mouse, I'm going to react with fear. So I experience fear. That's a legitimate experience of experiencing fear. And where did that fear come from in the first place? There's so much of our experience and our responses to things that are programmed, that are a pattern and a function of this past layering that was often gifted to us by others, by our caregivers, by our culture, all these stories. It's like maybe this This financial indicator is doing this, therefore be fearful. It means this, this, and this, which consequently affects you in this, that, and the other way. So be afraid is the conclusion. Instead of this indicator is doing this. And then what? What's the meaning we're making? And when we can recognize the meaning that we're making, the stories that we're telling, that gives us an inroad into being able to choose different stories. Because as we just discussed, the stories have a physiological, our response to the stories that we generate has a physiological effect. And so we really do have the opportunity to shift our well-being physically, mentally, emotionally by shifting our stories. We can use them in a deliberate way to be shaping our experience. But they're the experience, the present experience of something, when we're actually in the experience, the role of stories is very different from when we reflect upon the experience. And we use those stories to recreate those experiences or and to contextualize them. So we can do that in a way that creates upset and unease, dis-ease. Or we can use them in ways that cultivate greater well-being. But until we recognize and are able to distinguish the experience from the story, it makes it kind of impossible to shift the story, right? We need to recognize that there's story there in the first place. And that there are multitudes of ways, multitudes of stories to create for whatever experience we have. And a word for that is reframe. We have the ability to reframe our stories, to create new context, to create a new narrative. And one of the most important things that we can do as individuals and as members of the human experience here is to be consciously crafting our narratives about who we are individually, who we are collectively, stories of what's happening in the world and stories about what's happening on the planet, stories about what's possible. You know, we can look around and look at the climate crisis and look at the state of the world and say, game over. Or we can say, okay, now we get to really get to work. You know, now we get to be even more creative. Now we get to rally and come together in ways that we never have before. It's all the story that you choose to adopt. And if we choose to adopt it, the story of game over, politically, climate-wise, environmentally, if we choose game over, we're going to respond in a very different way. And our bodies are going to respond in a very different way than if we said, okay, let's do this thing. Or let's be from a different place that allows us to access opportunities and possibilities that were otherwise impossible. And the stories that we tell are the foundation of our capacity to be able to do any of that. So again, let's look at the distinction. Let's start distinguishing our stories. Let's start being accountable for our stories and for the realities that we're creating for ourselves. So that's it for today. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I invite you to please like, follow, and share Enlightened World Network and me. The links are in the description. And as always, it's such a tremendous privilege and pleasure to have these moments of musing together on what it is to be human. So until next time, so much love to you.